The old school, OG way of shopping for a car it was all about, don't never see behind the curtain. The oil undercoating is going to get thrown in for free, but, is there an oil undercoating or what the hell is an oil undercoating? Don't worry, you're going to get a lifetime fill-ups for your blinker fluid kind of situation. And as a result, that culture in the car dealerships has mostly gone away. In the watch business, there's a very close comparison to the old school way of selling watches. We have the knowledge, you don't. Do you want it or not?
Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Today we are joined by James Lamdin. And for those of you that know James, you know you're in for a memorable podcast. For those of you that don't know James, buckle up since you're in for quite the ride today. I can guarantee you that this Collectability Podcast will be unlike any other that you've listened to. You will be educated, entertained, and possibly even horrified by some of the things you're about to hear. In part one, we're going to learn about James' horological journey and discuss collecting on a more philosophical level. In part two, we're going to engage in a discussion on how one can collect Patek Philippe, especially targeted to those that are new to the collecting world. Before we begin, here is his official bio. James Lamdin launched AnalogShift in 2012 after two very different careers in outdoor equipment and luxury cars. A longtime watch collector, James' passion for vintage timepieces came to him from his grandfather, who left him part of his collection at the time of his passing. Put off by a way in which the traditional vintage market was run, James positioned AnalogShift to be a new kind of resource for the discerning enthusiast, dedicated to authenticity above all things. His affinity for well-aged transcends to his other passions, single malt scotch and automobiles. We'll talk about that soon. So with that, welcome, James.
John, I don't know. With an intro like that, I have to get an insurance rider, I think.
But I don't think that bio scratches the surface of who you are and what you built. So please tell us more about you, and we'll start with the best nickname you've ever had.
I don't know, maybe Jimmy the Whale.
Okay, let's start there.
Yeah, I gave myself that nickname.
Of course.
I only had one friend in college who ever called me Jimmy, but I got this whale tattoo in Hawaii about 5 years ago.
Okay.
And I was a little overweight, so I just started calling myself Jimmy the Whale. And I felt like if I was ever a street gangster, like that would probably stick, or in prison.
That is catchy.
I think so.
So I'm going to ask no further questions about the tattoo. I don't want to know, but I do want to know this. You're from Vermont, and
Yes.
And here's my follow-up question. Other than James Lamdin, what are the greatest three things to leave Vermont?
To leave Vermont?
To leave Vermont.
Like that they're not there anymore?
Exactly.
Well, I guess technically Ben & Jerry's is no longer based in Vermont.
We'll count that as two.
Ben and Jerry.
Okay. And the third?
The third best thing to ever leave Vermont outside me and Ben and Jerry. Boy, I don't know, John.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
At three.
Most of the thing about Vermont is that it's a really wonderfully beautiful and quiet place to grow up. But you know what they say, you spend your entire childhood trying to get away, and you spend your entire adult life trying to get back to wherever it is you came from. So I'm glad I left, and I wouldn't go back to Vermont, but I wouldn't mind going back to that pace of life. This is all to say that I don't think many people leave Vermont permanently. It's got an allure if you like, flannel and maple syrup.
Understood.
Yeah.
And cows.
Okay. Well, there are cow stories, but they are actually in Wyoming. So let's
all
put
right.
a pin in that for now.
We'll pass on that. So you and I were a bit late to connect, and it was through a mutual friend. And I recall it wasn't until 2017 that we first formally met and sat down over a chicken lunch. Do you remember that lunch and what we talked about?
I remember a couple lunches that sort of came in quick succession after we the thing is, John, I knew who you were because I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for who you are and what you were doing in the auction industry as I was coming up at AnalogShift, as well as wearing a few hats in, being a co-founder of Red Bar and very involved in the community of watches and a hack writer. Covering the watch industry. So I had met you, but I was probably just another guy across the the counter, so to speak, looking at watches. And I remember at one point you showed me this Zeppelin clock
Yes,
at
I remember
Christie's.
that.
That was
The set of three.
It was incredible. I still want that. But yes, when we connected, I do recall, I think, a very particular type of topic that we were covering, which is what the hell's going on in the auction industry and what's a good guy like you doing there?
This is a topic that continues to be relevant.
It does. So maybe we should talk about that a little.
Oh, we will.
Okay.
That's in there. We're going to talk about auctions.
All right, good.
That's a good teaser for later on. And I knew of you because I knew you had a New Jersey connection at first with AnalogShift. And I was always curious about the branding. Like, what is AnalogShift? Like, the first time you hear the name.
Yeah.
And I don't think many of our listeners are hearing AnalogShift's name for the first time, but maybe some of you don't know what AnalogShift is. So let's start there. What is it and how did it get started?
Yeah, AnalogShift is a name that I just liked the name. It sounded cool. And this was 12 or 13 years ago. So I got the name and sort of trademarked it, got the Instagram in the first year of Instagram,
Well done.
got the domain, all of that. And I knew after a career in the luxury automotive sector that I wanted to sort of get out of new commoditized disposable stuff and into my interests in analog things, whether those were cars or watches or something sartorial, vinyl, footwear, who knows? There were a bunch of things that interested me, but I was fed up with disposable tech and the digital irrelevancy, planned obsolescence. All of those things drove me nuts. And so I really wanted to take my passions in that area and shift the mindset to analog. At the beginning, I didn't know what I was going to do with that, whether it was going to be a content platform or a commerce platform or both. I didn't know if it was going to be cars or watches or both. And so I tried to get into the watch industry. And actually, this is the first time I connected with you, John, because I applied.
Oh, no.
Yeah, to work for you at some point. And by the way, I applied to work for everyone.
Was this Sotheby's or Christie's?
This must have been Sotheby's.
Okay.
So we're going back a ways here. This is pre-2010.
Got it.
And I wanted out of the car industry. I had some inspiration from some of my friends who have done very well for themselves in this industry. You've had a few of them on this podcast. And I wanted in. And I was prepared to sort of start at the lowest rung on that ladder. And I was looking for a junior position I applied at every auction house, every watch group, and most of the stores in town. And everyone, including you, said the same thing, which was go get some experience somewhere else and then give us a call in 6 months to a year. But I will say this, to your credit, to your never-ending credit, you gave me more than anyone else. You actually gave me names of places where I could go and cut my teeth, learn about the industry, learn about the product, and you were so generous with your offer. I bet I have that email somewhere in there, like 800,000 emails ago.
That's great.
Where you actually, gave me advice instead of said, thanks, kid, come back in a year once you know something. Basically, after sort of realizing at that time, which, wasn't that long ago, but it was a totally different marketplace.
Feels like a world ago. It's like 12, 13 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think I first applied for some job in the watch space probably in like 2009, something like that. And there were just no jobs in watches if you didn't already work in watches. And that has changed so much. I mean, everybody needs help now, qualified help.
Completely changed.
Completely changed. But I couldn't get inroads anywhere. And maybe I was a little less patient than I am today. But after some, consideration and some inspiration, I just decided to do it on my own. And I took that AnalogShift domain name and trademark that I just wanted to do something with at some point. And I said, okay, that's the watch thing. And so I started AnalogShift, knowing absolutely nothing about the digital space. So there's an irony of AnalogShift existing first in digital. It's not lost on me. And as anyone who's ever worked with me, for me, on my team, or peripherally knows, I can barely pair a Bluetooth to my phone. Never mind operate an e-commerce platform. So it's very true to the name. But at that time, there was virtually no one offering an e-commerce solution for vintage watches that wasn't maybe one of the re-commerce sites, a Gilt Group or a First Dibs kind of thing. And those were occasionally curated by a guest curator, but they weren't telling stories. And I loved the romanticism behind these things, and I wanted to share those stories. So I sort of thought of myself, and still do, as a part-time treasure hunter and a part-time storyteller. And I took both of those things, combined them on a sort of content-heavy commerce platform, and boom, launched AnalogShift in October of 2012 on Halloween.
On Halloween, of all days.
Which was also the same weekend as, I think, Hurricane Sandy.
Oh, wow.
Because all of the orders that we got in our first few days, we couldn't ship for about a week because all of the FedEx was snarled in the Northeast for days. And
so how did that feel on day one?
Well, we went into the black on day one. You know,
Okay.
we all of the startup costs and the digital and the website building and the investment that we made in our first sort of run of product, we broke even on day one. And originally, by the way, I should say, I was still looking for an actual job. Because I had quit my job because I hated my job. I'd gone on walkabout. I'd traveled and seen things and left New York and then realized that New York desperately needed me and I had to come back at all costs. And by that, I really mean that, New York had no idea who I was, but I needed New York. So I came back, was looking for a job, was starting AnalogShift on the side, thinking that would be a side hustle. And then, in day one, I realized that this could be a full-time
This was
thing.
it.
And that was it. And that was almost 12 years ago.
What's incredible is at the same time in your career, you've built your brand, AnalogShift. You've been building your brand as in the James Lamdin brand. And what I really respect about that and talking about others about you is that you're one of the few people that are fearless in saying your opinion and sharing your opinion out there, even if it might upset a few people. And that's probably gotten you in a little trouble over the years. Anything, care to comment on that?
Well, I think it's easy to share an opinion if you are self-aware that your opinion is worthless.
Okay, there you go.
I think, I think that this industry, like others, but particularly luxury with a capital L industry, and particularly our little niche corner of it, which isn't so little anymore, is pretty highfalutin and full of itself.
Yes.
And I learned, I didn't realize, let me put it like this. I didn't realize I was getting into the luxury industry at all. When I started writing about watches at about the same time. I'd been writing about cars a little. My editor called me and said, "You know about watches. You're doing a watch thing. Do you want to write about watches too?" And I said, "Oh, no, okay." And before I knew it, I was being ushered off to Switzerland. I was being loaned $30,000 or $40,000 press loaners to review. And I got invited to the Dunhill Christmas party that year. And I'm like, what the hell
is
am
that?
It's a really nice party, John.
There you go. All right.
And I didn't know what the hell I was doing there. I was just writing about watches. Why am I at this party with these very fancy, really cool people who know a lot? Thus, I found myself in the luxury industry. But with that, I very quickly realized the other side of that, and that's ego, and that's self-importance, and that's taking everything a little too seriously. So I try to take the piss out of it a little bit. We're not saving lives here. At best, we're preserving some history, telling some stories, maybe providing some joy.
Absolutely.
But that's about it. So I do have opinions, and I'm pretty loose with those opinions as best I can. I try to know my audience, but I'm the first one to maybe break somebody's illusion as to what this industry is.
Now, well said. And what's incredible is AnalogShift has been acquired by Watches of Switzerland.
Yes.
I'd like you to take us through that. And how does this multinational, which is a very serious company, which is an understatement, handle you?
Oh, okay.
Have fun with that one.
Yeah, okay. So I think that at the very beginning, when we began sort of expanding past our own little offices here in New York, we took on a little bit of investment. My partners and I began some sort of tactical partnerships with brick and mortar retailers around the country, offering on consignment mostly a selection of AnalogShift curated watches for their traditional brick and mortar showrooms. We had reached a certain level of, certainly relevance and awareness in the U.S. market and possibly overseas. So they were coming to us saying, hey, we'd love to actually have your stuff in Chicago or in Boston or wherever we might have gone. And then in 2018, I got a call from a PR firm, Battalion, who I've known for many years. And they said, hey, this big watch retailer from the UK is coming to New York. They want to do something with vintage. We'd like you to meet with them because you're the guy. So I went and met with the CEO and the deputy CEO of Watches of Switzerland here in New York City at the PR offices. And they said, well, we hear you're the guy to do vintage. We hear New Yorkers and Americans in general are really interested in vintage. We'd like to bring you in. And I had never considered doing one of these partnerships in New York City since it was my town, it's my backyard. But I said, all right, let's try it. And we launched at the Soho flagship store for Watches of Switzerland when they opened their doors in November of 2018. And we became one of the highest volume brands in the store. And of course, we aren't a brand. We're a brand, but we're not making anything. We're curating it. So after those other two big brands, we were really holding up the volume game. And that was going very well. So we expanded to another store. And then they gave us a call in 2020 and said, hey, you want to come over here full time? And that's where I sort of put pause on it emotionally and said, is this the right move? Because it wasn't the first time I had been approached. But I looked at sort of the relationship we had, which was incredibly positive. And then we talked about what they wanted to do with AnalogShift. And they wanted to leave AnalogShift alone, at least from the branding standpoint. And that was exciting to me because they weren't trying to pull AnalogShift to fit their brand. They wanted to use AnalogShift as a brand that could grow what they're doing and what their knowledge level is in diversifying their portfolio as they expand globally. And also gave us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how the retail side of the business really functions. We took them up on their offer, stuck around, and with their resources, we sort of enhanced our branding and our presence, rolling out eventually to 25 stores around the country.
Incredible.
Revamped our website, which was in dire need of that because, again, I built it pretty bad. But kept our storytelling, our attention to detail, our focus on authenticity, great photography, and a little bit of that quirk intact. And most of the time, they give me a pretty long leash because I think they recognize the value in having some authentic personality and an opinion in a space that is unusual for a retailer to play in. So I have to try and swear a little bit less on Zoom calls. But other than that, I have to say a huge thanks to Watches of Switzerland for the last 3.5 years of helping me grow AnalogShift to a degree I could have never imagined without those resources. Thank you to them also for giving me opportunities to learn about a different section of this industry, which is retail, which is a whole other thing. And to interface with them and collaborate on growing both sides. So it's been fun.
In looking at your website, or the AnalogShift's subset of Watches of Switzerland, they've certainly allowed you to keep your own independent voice. Yes. Like you said, there's a quirkiness.
Yeah.
There's a bit of fun and whimsy and intelligence and sarcasm, and it's enjoyable in a way.
Thank you. I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that there's so many, really self-important personalities in the watch industry. And what worries me about that, first off, I love that it's such a dynamic industry. I listened to your conversation with Michael Friedman just very recently, and I agree with him. This is a golden age for the watch industry. There's a lot of exciting things happening between the micro brand space and the auction industry and the vintage space and, even the hype cycle. It's a fascinating and exciting time to be in watches, whereas, you and he had been doing this since the 90s. I started collecting in the early 2000s, and there was no information coming out of the Swiss watch industry, and we were like clinging to Watch You Seek or Time Zone or Purist, hoping for a nugget, or standing by the magazine cart to get that German watch magazine that I couldn't read but had pretty pictures.
Yes.
Now there's so much content coming from the watch space every day. It's dynamic. It's exciting, but it's often pretty self-important. And the tastemakers or influencers or personalities in the space, they're a little rigid. They're a little rigid for my taste. Some of them I get along with, and I know they're playing a little bit of a role. Some of them that's who they are. And, they have the personality of some moss growing on a rock in the woods somewhere. And that's just not romantic. I mean, it's not romantic. And nerdiness is part of this. And there's no shame on nerdiness. I'm a nerd. But like, lighten up, have some fun with this. So, especially through our social media channels, we try to get, a good balance of, the data and the nerdiness and the luxury and the romanticism and a little bit of whimsy and goofiness. Because again, we're not saving lives.
And with that, well said. Thank you for sharing that. I am challenging you now to walk on a tightrope.
Okay.
This next question is, what do you think about brands engaging with vintage watches, as in the brands from mostly Geneva and Switzerland in general? How do you feel about them, how they're engaging in the pre-owned and vintage market today?
Well, first off, I think any brand that cares about its heritage, and this entire industry is built on heritage, needs to be paying attention to what their watches are doing on the secondary market or the tertiary market or the proper vintage market. And, I've been in auction rooms that you led where there were museum curators from these brands buying up products for their museums, and I think that's great. I think it's great that brands pay a lot of attention to the secondary market of their products so that they can use that data to inform what they're doing next. And by the way, I do the same thing in reverse. I'm looking at what's selling and what's popular on the modern side to help gauge what I should be buying on the secondary side or the vintage side. What's the next big thing? Or even, boy, those are going to be really hard to get. Let me see if I can pick up a few on the secondary market. It's both of those things. As for entering the space, maybe with more intent, I think it's overdue. And I will say that outright, that years ago I said, God help us all, but the Swiss watch industry needs to learn from the car dealerships, right? Car dealerships, I worked in them, don't make money selling new cars. They make their money in financing, parts, service, and pre-owned. So the narrative might be a little bit different. The need for capital might be a little bit different. But the net effect is that you build up a trust, and you don't want to go buy a used Jeep from Bob's Corner, Automart Superstore, on Route 17. You want to go to Chrysler Dodge Jeep and get a certified pre-owned Jeep Rubicon Unlimited, with a 5-year powertrain warranty extension. That really works. And American consumers in particular really like to know that everything they're getting is authentic and backed. So in the Swiss watch industry, where that has always been a little bit of a veil of who's selling this to me and is it legit, and did that guy take it out of his trench coat on Canal Street and tell me it's the real thing, or possibly even in an auction house where some shady things were going down behind the scenes, wink, nod. I think it's good that brands are going to pay attention to it and support the secondary and tertiary market for these watches. With that said, some brands are trying to control the secondary market, or may have a very tightened approach to what it is that they'll actually stand behind. Part of that is ego, and part of that is knowledge. There aren't repair centers or even the ateliers in Switzerland. They are not brimming with young people who know the entire history of their own brand's products.
True. Yeah.
And so unless we can begin to clone John Reardon's and the type and put them into all of these maisons to do the work to make sure that they know what they're actually doing with their own watches, whether that's from conservative restoration or from parts, we might need more gaskets if we're going to get a lot of those watches in, to be serviced and certified. You might want to make more of those. Things like that. Those decisions, you need to have somebody who's expertly trained and becomes a true specialist, not in the current collection, not in a generalist sense, but knows their past and their history. And that is probably the piece that I haven't seen really come through yet on any of the large-scale projects.
Your insight into how the automotive world has handled this almost evolved in a way to embrace pre-owned. It's part of the culture
100%.
of retail is fascinating. And I really wonder if that's the direction we're going. I think it could take a decade to get there or more.
I think it will take quite a while. But, there's an interesting another interesting comparison there to be made, which is that the shady car dealership days they're starting to go away, because there has been a bit of a even keeling effect of the internet. It's sort of democratized the way people shop for cars, whether it's the offer for your trade-in, because you can plug your car in online and you'll get an offer from 6 dealerships in your area. And if you don't like the deal that you're getting cut on the trade-in or even on the new car offer, you can just go to the next guy. Whereas the old school, OG way of shopping for a car was all about, don't never see behind the curtain. The oil undercoating is going to get thrown in for free, but, is there an oil undercoating or what the hell is an oil undercoating? Don't worry, you're going to get a lifetime fill-ups for your blinker fluid kind of situation. And as a result, that culture in the car dealerships has mostly gone away. In the watch business, there's a very close comparison to the old school way of selling watches. We have the knowledge, you don't, do you want it or not? And that's where that ego and that self-importance needs to go away in order for this industry to evolve. I actually do believe that more transparency, involvement from the brands, and yes, educating your customer, educating your client, that's where all ships rise. But when you have a few bad hombres like trying to hold back information and do it their own old school way, that's where people get hosed. And then those people never have the opportunity to enjoy it.
I'm so glad you said that because I'm thinking that, but that's the first time I've heard it articulated.
I try to say bad hombres like at least twice a day.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, coming back to fostering talent in the industry and especially encouraging younger people to get into watches. And I completely forgot that we had that conversation when I was at Sotheby's.
Yep.
But
That's okay.
I'm glad you didn't come into Sotheby's because I think your career trajectory would be completely different.
Oh my God, I have a list of things.
You could be a bad hombre right now.
I could be, well, John, I'll be honest with you. I think that we're going to go to a dark place for a second. I think there's something very compelling in this industry, maybe every industry, but in this industry, it seems it has a point. It's a very pointed trajectory for a lot of people. Maybe it's the fact that it's still small, dynamic, and growing. People have been able to hitch their cart to that, build up a personal brand, take a good photograph, memorize a few historical anecdotes, and become the guy or gal. And then what happens is, if they aren't really sort of paying a close attention to their own ethical and moral compass, or they're just completely devoid of one from the beginning, it's very easy to become a villain. It's very easy to lie to a customer or to omit something from a customer or to take advantage of the way a product is being presented or hyped and screw people and get rich. And I love the line from Batman because I think that's pretty much what it is. You either die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. I have to remind myself every single day. I look at myself in the mirror and I say, don't be a villain today, because it would be super easy. That's not how I was brought up. My mama instilled me with some good virtues, and I try to just stay true to that. But it would get a lot easier if I stopped being totally honest or stopped actually pointing out things that I want my customers to know about, instead of just saying, oh yeah, here's a great watch, and they trust me because of who I am or who my brand is. And John, frankly, that's why I have such tremendous respect for you, because you're one of a very small group of people who I have ever met who've worked in the auction industry, who to me is honest as the day is long. And that's why, bringing it back to the chicken lunch, I want to know what the hell you were doing in the auction industry. It took me years to figure this all out, but when I did, I'm like, am I wrong about how this goes? Or what can John tell me? And so that's why I wanted to chat with you.
That is a hot topic. Oh, now you're turning the interview around.
Yes.
Yes. I'm still recovering from my auction years.
The trauma?
It's a post-traumatic, I say that lightly. It was an experience. It was a job. I met some amazing clients. I was with incredible watches. And but now that the further I step away from that world, I just realized the whole structure of the business model is so harshly profit-driven.
Mm-hmm.
And so aggressively, not in all cases, in some cases, puts ethics second, honesty third, integrity seems to be forgotten in many cases.
Of course.
There's some great people in the auction world. There's amazing watches consistently in the auction world, but
fewer than the auction world would like you to believe there are.
Yes.
But yes.
But there's a reason a lot of watches do show up publicly at auction, and it's the experts' job to really help farm out the problems before they become your problem.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a delicate balance in the auction world because those folks are representing the seller and not the buyer, and I think this is something that's often forgotten.
Yes, or that a lot of the press and media that comes in behind an auction highlight or moment are paid for. I mean, that's what PR is, and it has a place, and I also know great people in PR, but the spin factor is crazy. And I'm not blowing smoke here. I mean, let's look at the popularity of watch auctions over the last just 4 or 5 years. Like, they've become spectacles. They're reported on. Mm-hmm. They're standing room only. They're selling tickets, and don't get me wrong, you go to see a master auctioneer at work, it's a ballet. It's a beautiful thing.
It is. It's a work of art in its own way.
But you have to sort of squint at it a little bit and say, is this passing the sniff test? I was in a room, I won't say which auction house or who was doing what, but there was a bidder in the room who was on the board of the auction house. Not that he's not allowed, but he was bidding on a product that was definitely consigned from a buddy of his, and he was sort of shill bidding. And somebody stood up in the auction room and screamed at him.
Wow.
I sat there with a smile on my face because I said, it's happening.
Yes.
Finally,
some exposure and transparency.
The exposure, transparency, and the reckoning is coming.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to walk this very carefully because there are good people in this industry and there are certainly good watches. But somehow the names of these auction houses carry such gravitas and weight that they seem beyond reproach to novice or excitable collectors. And it couldn't be further from the truth, right? I mean, you can speak to that better than I can. I'm just looking at it from the outside going, what the?
It's relatively unregulated marketplace. And here's the bottom line. We don't often know who the buyer is, but sometimes we see who the buyer is of a particular watch. But who cares about who the buyer is? We want to know who the underbidder is. Who's the person that's on the phone pushing the price? What's the auctioneer doing from the book? What's actually happening in the room that you can't see? And that is the one thing I take away from my auction experience, that I enjoy going to auctions because I'm just sitting there seeing trying to put together what's really happening in the room.
Yeah.
But I have to emphasize that there's a lot of great watches and a lot of great people at auction.
Of course there are.
But there is some intrigue too. There's office intrigue.
Prestidigitation.
Yes.
It's my favorite word. Sleight of hand. Prestidigitation.
That's a great word.
It's also the word that I'd sort of challenged myself to spell if I'd had too much to drink, and if I couldn't spell it, I had to go home.
So that's your test.
Well, okay. I mean, yeah. I didn't actually hold myself to that, but.
So, other than cars, you're also interested in television and movies.
Oh yeah.
So, just for a bit of fun, 2 questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a character on The Office, are you a Michael or are you a Dwight?
Oh my God, I'm a mite.
A mite. Oh,
yeah.
In between the two.
In between the two.
Okay.
Yeah,
I get that.
I think that I definitely have like a little bit of a Napoleon complex, but also a super nerd.
Okay.
So, yeah, it depends on whether or not I've had a lot of caffeine, I think.
All right. So, Mite, Jimmy the Whale, the list.
Jimmy the Whale. Yeah.
All right, with the new Ghostbusters movie coming out, which Ghostbuster are you?
I've always been Ray Stantz. And
Really?
Thank you so much for asking me that. I've been waiting my whole life for somebody to ask me that on a podcast, John.
Tell us why.
Well, he's the heart of the Ghostbusters.
Yes.
You know, and plus it's Dan Aykroyd. You know, I realize, Bill Murray gets the girl, and Harold Ramis, rest in peace. He was the brains, and Winston Zeddemore, Ernie Hudson. He was the heart, or he was the strength. But Dan Aykroyd was the one who wanted to make Ghostbusters a thing. His character was the one who made it a business and just worked his ass off and ate way too much Chinese takeout and Twinkies and smoked too many cigarettes. And he was the one who was the glue. And I think that that's who I've always identified with, is Ray.
So with your interest in movies and in television, this clearly crosses over into the world of watch collecting and watch selling. And nowhere can this scene better than your video, The Stealing Time itself, that you did with AnalogShift. And if our listeners haven't seen this yet, go to YouTube, go look up AnalogShift and look at the Stealing Time itself video. You're in for a treat. What was the inspiration for that? And I just can't believe they gave you the blessing to produce that video.
They didn't.
Okay.
I totally snuck that into a rebranding budget that they had no visibility on and will never have any visibility on unless they listen to this podcast.
Okay, that's a test. I like that.
I try to have a daily or weekly act of piracy in my company, all good spirited for the purposes of bettering the business. But yeah, that's the kind of.
But a full length animation, that was impressive.
It was pretty cool. Yeah, it's the kind of thing that never would have made it past the review board, but snuck it in there, and it's actually playing in all of our stores in our display cases. So it was embraced. I think here's the thing that AnalogShift is good at, and that is. I don't think any brand in this space can be everything to everyone. But AnalogShift can come pretty close because we're blending all of those elements I mentioned earlier, whether it's the investment angle, the luxury angle, the fashion angle, the nerd angle, the whimsy angle, the goofy angle. We can put it all together with this broad assortment of product from across 100 years of history and design. And I started sort of creating this notion of having these moments in time that were defined by a style, whether it's the 50s or the 70s, that what are the colors that those elements pull in and what are the fashions that pull in, and then how can I create sort of this palette that expresses all of it, from pre-World War II to the 1990s. And that gelled into this, adventure story with these characters who were straight out of, Hanna-Barbera, like Johnny Quest, right? That had something to do with watches. And we created them into sort of like the AnalogShift, time team. And they're rescuing these time orbs from the villainous Quartz Corporation. And we just had so much fun with it. And then as it all came together, and you'll notice the watches that are just stylized animated versions of, referential, watches that sort of, held up for that character or that moment. You'll notice that the watches each have a different style. The animation of the character changes a little bit based on the style or era that we're trying to achieve. And we got this cool thing together, and then we reached out to our some friends of ours who are The Midnight, which is this synthwave group that is just killing it. And I said, is there any chance you would take a look at this and see if it might be something you could lay down a track for? And they did. And so we got a custom piece from The Midnight, which is this properly retro 1980s vibe synth thing, but it could be all of the above. And it just came together beautifully, and I can't wait to make the second installment next time I can slide something into a budget somewhere.
That's fantastic.
Sorry, boss. I hope you're not listening.
Yes, I truly hope management's not listening. But now we have a little collectability homework for everyone. They have to go watch this video while they're waiting to listen to part 2.
Okay,
But this concludes part 1 of our discussion with James Lamdin. I'm going to have a cliffhanger question for you as we pivot the whole conversation in part 2 to all things Patek Philippe. I would like to know from you is what is the most overlooked category of vintage Patek Philippe collecting today? But you can't answer now. You're going to answer to kick off part 2. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any future episodes. This is John Reardon for Collectability.